You always start strong. A new routine, a new goal, a new mindset. For a few days, maybe even a few weeks, you feel unstoppable. You wake up early. You stay focused. You tell yourself, this time is different. But then something happens. Not all at once. Quietly. You miss one day, then another. You begin negotiating with yourself. The excitement disappears. The discipline fades. And before you know it, you're right back where you started. You call it a lack of consistency. You blame your motivation. You tell yourself you just need more willpower. But what if none of that is the real reason? What if the point where you always collapse isn't random? What if your mind has been leading you there all along? Because the truth is, you don't have a problem with starting. You have a psychological pattern that expects the ending. And until you expose that pattern, every new beginning will quietly lead you back to the same place. If you've ever wondered why you can commit to something with complete confidence, only to abandon it a few weeks later, this video isn't going to give you another productivity system. It's going to expose the hidden mechanism behind that cycle, because most people believe consistency is about discipline. But discipline is only what you see on the surface. Underneath it is something much more powerful: your identity. Every action you repeat, every promise you keep, and every promise you break is teaching your brain who you believe you are. That's why this pattern feels so frustrating. You're not just losing progress. You're reinforcing a story. A story that whispers, I always quit. I never follow through. I'm just not consistent. And the more often you repeat that story, the more convincing it becomes. In this video, we're going to uncover why you always seem to collapse at the exact same point, why the hardest part isn't starting, and why your biggest obstacle has never been a lack of motivation. It's been an identity that's quietly expecting you to fail before you even begin. The strange thing about your pattern isn't that you quit. It's that you almost always begin with incredible enthusiasm. Think back to the last goal you set. Maybe it was going to the gym, starting a business, learning a new skill, reading every day, waking up earlier. For the first few days, everything felt different. You didn't need reminders. You didn't need discipline. You wanted to do it. You imagined the person you were about to become. You pictured the results. You felt inspired. And because those emotions were so strong, you mistook them for commitment. But excitement and commitment are not the same thing. Excitement is emotional. Commitment is intentional. Excitement asks, how do I feel today? Commitment asks, who am I becoming? That's why starting feels so easy. At the beginning, you're running on possibility. Your imagination is doing most of the work. You haven't faced resistance yet. You haven't had to choose the goal over your comfort. You haven't been tested. Starting is exciting because it allows you to dream without demanding much from you. There's something deeply satisfying about making a plan, buying the notebook, creating the schedule, watching motivational videos, telling yourself, tomorrow, everything changes. For a brief moment, you feel like a different person. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Many people become addicted to that feeling, not the progress, the beginning, because beginnings are full of hope. They don't ask you to prove anything. You can imagine success without confronting the difficult process required to earn it. That's why some people have started the same journey 10 times, not because they love the goal, but because they love the emotional high that comes with a fresh start. And without realizing it, they become collectors of beginnings instead of builders of outcomes. The problem isn't that you enjoy starting. The problem is that you've confused the emotion of beginning with the identity of becoming. Real transformation doesn't happen when you're excited. It begins the moment excitement disappears, and you decide to continue anyway. Because that's the moment you're no longer chasing a feeling. You're building a person. And for most people, that's exactly where the real battle begins. The collapse never happens on the first day. It rarely happens on the second. In fact, for a while, everything seems to be working. You begin to believe you've finally changed. You feel proud of yourself. You think, maybe this is the time I actually become consistent. Then, without warning, you hit what feels like an invisible wall. Nothing dramatic happens. No major crisis. No life-changing event. You simply wake up one morning, And doing the same thing suddenly feels heavier than it did yesterday. The morning run feels optional. The book feels difficult to open. The work you've been excited about suddenly feels exhausting. The gym starts feeling like an obligation instead of an opportunity. And because the feeling changed, you assume something is wrong. You tell yourself, maybe I've lost motivation. Maybe this routine isn't for me. Maybe I just need a break. But that's not what's happening. You're standing at the exact point where almost everyone turns back. Because the beginning was fueled by novelty. Now novelty is gone. And what's left is repetition. This is the point where your brain stops receiving the reward of something new. The excitement fades. The compliments fade. The visible progress slows down. You're no longer chasing the thrill of starting. You're facing the quiet reality of becoming. And becoming is repetitive. It's ordinary. It's often invisible. No one applauds you for showing up on day 23. No one celebrates the 5th week of consistency. No one notices the hundreds of ordinary decisions that slowly build an extraordinary life. That's why this stage feels so empty. Your emotions stop rewarding you, long before your results begin rewarding you. And that's where most people make a fatal mistake. They interpret the absence of excitement as proof they're on the wrong path, when in reality, it's proof they've finally reached the part that actually changes them. Think about every meaningful skill you've ever admired. Playing an instrument, building a business, getting into incredible shape, writing a book, mastering a craft. None of those were built through constant excitement. They were built through repetition, through days that felt ordinary, through mornings when the motivation was gone but the commitment remained. The invisible wall exists because it's the point where fantasy ends and identity begins. Up until now, you've been acting like someone pursuing a goal. Now life is asking a much harder question. Can you become the kind of person who keeps going when nothing feels exciting anymore? That question cannot be answered with motivation. It can only be answered with identity. And this is where your old identity begins to fight back. Because the version of you that has always quit before recognizes this moment. It has been here many times. It knows what usually comes next. The excuses, the delay, the missed day, the promise to start again on Monday. What feels like an invisible wall is often a collision between two identities. The person you're trying to become, and the person you've repeatedly proven yourself to be. And until one of those identities wins, you'll keep arriving at the same point, mistaking it for the end, when it's actually the beginning of real transformation. The human mind is always trying to answer one question. Based on everything that's happened before, what is most likely to happen next? That's how your brain keeps you safe. It learns from repetition. It recognizes patterns. It predicts outcomes. And most of the time, that's incredibly useful. If you touch a hot stove once, your brain remembers. If a road is dangerous, your brain becomes cautious. It constantly builds expectations from your past experiences. But here's the problem. Your brain doesn't only learn from physical experiences. It also learns from your behavior. Every time you start something, and then abandon it, your brain records the entire sequence. Not just the beginning, the ending. It begins to expect it. Think about how many times you've said, "This time I'll stay consistent." And think about how many times that sentence was followed by the same outcome. Eventually, your mind stops treating those words as a promise. It treats them as the opening scene of a familiar story. A story it already knows the ending to. That's why something strange starts happening. Long before you actually quit, you begin preparing to quit. Not consciously. Psychologically. You become slightly less committed. You skip one small habit. You start making tiny exceptions. You tell yourself, one day won't matter. You become more willing to negotiate with yourself. And those negotiations aren't random. They're your brain trying to recreate the ending it has learned to expect. Because certainty is comfortable, even when that certainty leads to failure. Read that again. Your mind would often rather experience a familiar failure than an unfamiliar success. Why? Because success changes your identity, and failure protects it. If you've spent years seeing yourself as someone who never follows through, then actually following through creates an internal conflict. Suddenly, the story you've been telling yourself no longer fits, and changing that story is uncomfortable. It requires you to let go of an identity you've carried for years. Ironically, people often think they're afraid of failure. But in moments like this, they're actually afraid of becoming someone unfamiliar. Because unfamiliar identities feel uncertain, even when they're better. That's why you'll sometimes sabotage yourself right before a breakthrough. Not because you don't want success, but because success demands a new version of you. A version you've never learned to trust. And your brain always prefers the known over the unknown. Even if the known keeps making you miserable. This is why collapse feels so predictable. You're not simply running out of motivation. You're following a script your mind has rehearsed dozens of times. Every missed workout. Every abandoned project. Every unfinished goal. Every promise you made to yourself and quietly broke. They've all been teaching your brain the same lesson. This is how our stories end. So when you reach the familiar point where you've always collapsed before, your brain doesn't see danger in quitting. It sees normality. It sees consistency. It sees proof that the old identity is still true. And unless you consciously interrupt that prediction, your future will continue to look like your past. Not because you lack potential, but because you've trained your mind to expect the same ending before you've even reached it. At this point, you might be wondering, if my brain expects me to fail, how do I stop it? Most people answer that question the wrong way. They look for a better routine, a better planner, a better productivity app, a better morning schedule, a better strategy. And when those don't work, they assume they just haven't found the right system yet. But think about your own life. How many systems have you already tried? How many YouTube videos have you watched? How many books have you read? How many routines have you started? How many fresh starts have you promised yourself? The problem has never been a lack of information. You already know what you're supposed to do. You know you should exercise. You know you should stop procrastinating. You know you should sleep earlier. You know you should spend less time on your phone. You know you should keep your promises. Knowledge isn't what's missing. Identity is. Because every action you take is filtered through the answer to one silent question. What kind of person am I? You may never ask yourself that question out loud, but your behavior answers it every single day. If deep down, you believe you're someone who always gives up, your actions will quietly protect that belief. If you believe you're inconsistent, you'll unconsciously behave like someone who's inconsistent. If you believe you've never had discipline, you'll keep searching for motivation because discipline doesn't feel like part of who you are. That's why changing your habits without changing your identity feels like wearing someone else's clothes. For a while, you can force yourself to wear them. But eventually, you'll want to return to what feels familiar. Because human beings naturally act in ways that confirm who they believe they are. This is why two people can follow the exact same plan and get completely different results. One person says, "I'm trying to become someone who exercises." The other says, "I'm someone who takes care of my body." The behavior looks identical, but psychologically, they're worlds apart. One is borrowing an action. The other is expressing an identity. And identities don't have to negotiate every morning. They don't wake up asking, "Do I feel like being this person today?" They simply act in alignment with who they believe they are. Now think about your own pattern. Every time you've collapsed, what story did you tell yourself afterward? "I knew this would happen. I always do this. I can't stay consistent." Those aren't observations. They're identity statements. And every time you repeat them, you make them a little more believable. Until eventually, they stop sounding like opinions. They sound like facts. But they're not facts. They're conclusions drawn from repeated behavior. And what repeated behavior created, repeated behavior can rewrite. The tragedy is that you've spent years trying to change your life, without ever questioning the identity that keeps recreating it. You've been fighting your habits, when you should have been confronting the person you've unconsciously become. Because the moment your identity changes, consistency stops feeling like a battle. It starts feeling like the natural expression of who you are. And that's the shift most people never make. They keep changing their plans, while protecting the very identity that keeps destroying them. That's why they keep arriving at the same ending. Not because they don't know what to do, but because they're still doing it as the same person they've always believed themselves to be. There's one truth about human psychology that almost nobody talks about. Your mind doesn't always choose what's best for you. It chooses what's familiar. Read that again. Because this explains why intelligent people sabotage themselves, why talented people stay stuck, why capable people repeatedly stop just before things begin to change. Most people believe they're afraid of failure. But if that were true, they wouldn't keep starting. They start because they genuinely want a better life. They want the stronger body, the successful business, the disciplined mind, the healthier relationships, the peaceful life. The desire is real. So why do they always retreat? Because the moment that new life starts becoming real, something else begins to feel threatened. The old version of you. Think about it. For years, you've lived with certain habits, certain excuses, certain beliefs about yourself. They've become familiar. Not because they're good, but because they're known. And the human mind has an extraordinary ability to mistake familiarity for safety. That's why people stay in jobs they hate, stay in relationships that drain them, keep habits that slowly destroy them, not because they're happy, but because they're predictable. Now apply that to your own life. Imagine you've been telling yourself for years, "I'm not disciplined. I never finish what I start. Consistency just isn't me." Then suddenly, you've been consistent for 30 days, 40 days, 50 days. Something unexpected begins to happen. Your old identity starts losing its grip, and instead of feeling only excitement, you begin feeling something else. Discomfort. Not because you're failing, but because you're changing. And change is unfamiliar. Your brain starts asking questions you've never had to answer before. If I'm no longer the person who always quits, then who am I? If I actually succeed, what excuses will I have left? If I become disciplined, what will life expect from me now? Those questions rarely enter your conscious mind, but they shape your behavior, because every new level of growth comes with new responsibility. It's easy to dream about becoming successful. It's much harder to become the person who has to live as that successful version every single day. Success isn't just new rewards. It's a new standard, a new identity, a new level of accountability. And that's where many people quietly pull themselves backward. Not because they don't deserve success, not because they lack ability, but because returning to the familiar feels psychologically safer than stepping into the unknown. This is why you collapse at almost the exact same point. Not when the work becomes impossible, but when the old identity realizes it's about to be replaced. And it fights to survive. It whispers, "Take a break. You've earned today off. Start again next week. One missed day won't matter." Those thoughts sound reasonable. That's why they're dangerous. Because they aren't trying to destroy your progress in one dramatic moment. They're trying to guide you back toward the person you've always been. One small decision at a time. One compromise at a time. One excuse at a time. Until you're standing exactly where you've stood so many times before. Looking at another abandoned goal. Wondering what went wrong. Nothing went wrong. Your old identity simply won the argument again. And until you recognize that battle, you'll keep blaming motivation for a war that's actually being fought between the person you've always been and the person you're afraid to become. Because every collapse has been protecting something, not your future, your familiarity. There comes a moment in every person's life when they get tired. Not tired of working, not tired of trying, tired of becoming the same person over and over again. Tired of standing at another starting line. Tired of making another promise they secretly don't believe. Tired of saying, "This time will be different," while carrying the exact same identity that produced every previous ending. If that's where you are, then don't make another promise. Make a different decision. Stop chasing the feeling of a new beginning. Start becoming the person who no longer needs one. Because think about it. The strongest people you know aren't constantly restarting their lives. They aren't waiting for Monday, or January, or the first day of the month. They simply continue. Some days with energy, some days without it. Some days inspired, some days exhausted. But they continue. Not because they're more motivated than you, but because they've stopped asking motivation for permission. Their actions no longer depend on how they feel. They depend on who they've decided to be. That's the shift you've been missing. You've been trying to perform consistency, instead of becoming consistent. There's a difference. Performing consistency is something you do when you're motivated. Becoming consistent is something you do because it's no longer negotiable. Think about brushing your teeth. You don't wake up every morning asking, "Do I feel inspired enough to brush my teeth today?" You don't search for motivation. You don't watch motivational videos. You don't wait for the perfect mood. You do it because it's part of who you are. It's an identity. Now imagine if keeping promises to yourself became just as automatic. Imagine if showing up for your goals felt less like a battle, and more like brushing your teeth. Ordinary. Expected. Simply part of who you are. That transformation doesn't happen in one dramatic breakthrough. It happens in quiet moments that almost nobody notices. The morning you don't feel like getting up, and you get up anyway. The workout you complete without excitement. The page you write when inspiration never comes. The difficult conversation you stop avoiding. The promise you keep when nobody would know if you broke it. Those moments seem small, but psychologically, they're enormous. Because every time you follow through, you're giving your brain new evidence. Evidence that the old story is no longer true. For years, your identity was built by repeated self-betrayal. Now it will be rebuilt by repeated self-respect. Not in one day, not in 1 week, but one kept promise at a time. Every time you refuse to quit where you normally quit, you interrupt the prediction your brain has been making for years. You teach it a new ending, and eventually, that new ending becomes the expectation. The place where you used to collapse becomes the place where you continue. The place where you used to negotiate becomes the place where you decide. The place where you used to prove you couldn't change becomes the place where you finally prove that you can. And one day, you'll realize something extraordinary. You didn't become consistent because you found the perfect system. You became consistent because you stopped introducing yourself to life as the person who always quits. You became someone new. And once your identity changes, starting is no longer the hardest part. Because you no longer live a life that's constantly starting over. You live a life that keeps moving forward. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this video, it's this. You were never trapped by a lack of discipline. You were trapped by a pattern. A pattern that quietly convinced you every new beginning would eventually become another ending. And the more times you repeated that cycle, the more it stopped feeling like a habit, and started feeling like your identity. You didn't just believe you would quit. You began living as someone who always does. That's why every fresh start carried an invisible weight. Because you weren't only trying to build a new habit, you were trying to outrun a story that had been following you for years. But here's the truth. Your past is evidence. It is not a prophecy. Yes, you've quit before. Yes, you've broken promises to yourself. Yes, you've watched goals slowly disappear. But none of those moments decided who you must become. They only described who you had been. And there is a difference. Because identity is not something you discover. It's something you repeatedly demonstrate. Every promise you keep, every excuse you refuse, every day you continue after the excitement disappears, is another piece of evidence. Evidence that the old story is losing its grip. You don't become a disciplined person the day you feel different. You become one the day you stop allowing temporary emotions to decide permanent directions. That's the moment your identity begins to shift. Not dramatically, quietly, almost invisibly. Until one day you look back and realize you didn't just finish the goal. You became someone who finishes. The next time you feel yourself approaching the point where you always quit, don't ask yourself, "Do I still feel motivated?" Ask yourself, "Am I about to repeat my old identity or build a new one?" Because that moment, the moment where you've always collapsed, isn't where your story ends. It's where your real story finally has the chance to begin. If this video exposed a pattern you've been living without realizing it, subscribe. Because this channel isn't about motivation. It's about exposing the hidden psychological systems that quietly shape your behavior, and helping you replace them with patterns that lead to genuine self-mastery. And if this message challenged the way you see yourself, leave this comment. I don't start over. I continue. Not because it's a motivational quote, but because it's a declaration of identity. A decision to stop collecting fresh starts. A decision to stop letting yesterday predict tomorrow. A decision to become the kind of person who keeps going long after the excitement disappears. Because the life you've been chasing doesn't belong to the person who starts the strongest. It belongs to the person who refuses to stop.